COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun. First of all, we hope you had a very good Memorial Day weekend. We're back the Tuesday after Memorial Day weekend talking with an old friend, Professor Marshall Carver. We got to know Marshall through the years in his role as a sell-side research analyst, both with Heikkinen Energy Advisors as well as Tudor Pickering Holt. Marshall, however, has been at Tulane now teaching. And even more interesting, he's been doing sort of a professor exchange program where he's been going over to China and teaching in China. He's joining us from Beijing. Marshall, you're an old friend, a smart friend, an interesting guy. But I tell you this, the frequency with which you're getting to China, you're connected to China, it's really striking. It used to happen many years ago that people traveled like this, but you're still doing it. You're still maintaining that connectivity. So thank you so much for joining us this evening from China. We can't wait to hear your views.
Yes, happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Well, we're excited. Mike, what would you tell the world about the markets? What you're watching post Memorial Day? There's always excitement in today's energy world.
Yeah, Maynard, I'd say with earnings behind us, I mean, there's not a lot going on right now. Really, the markets are just focused on what's going on with Iran. This seems like this, we talk about this every week. Ceasefire's on, ceasefire's not on. Crude oil's down $4 or $5 here in the last day or so because there looks to be a ceasefire. At the same time, you're seeing some battles going on. So who knows what's going to happen here? You know, I look at basically the bond market. We got up to almost 4.7%. Now we're back down to 4.5%. The markets are coming off a little bit on, some hope that there's going to be some war resolution here in the next day or two. We'll see what happens there. So like I said, markets right now, they're just all about what's happening in Iran. And so we'll see how that develops. We don't have any handicap on that whatsoever. I'd say from an energy market standpoint, I think markets now, with earnings behind us, are looking at where's the next big deal going to come from. We had the Shell Arc deal. We had a Dominion NextEra deal. I think markets are looking for big deals, see what's going to come here. And now that the first quarter earnings are behind us. So, that's kind of a wrap up. Like I said, this is, it's been very volatile over the last 2.5, 3 months. We don't see really anything on the horizon, at least right now from a reporting standpoint. So hopefully this will be a calm week, but that's where we are right now. Maynard, back to you.
Okay, Mike. Arjun, what would you throw in as we turn to our friend, Professor Carver?
Yeah, thanks, Maynard. Maybe I'll just kind of build upon some of Mike's comments and just maybe preview a little bit what this week's Super Spike will be about. One of the questions is, we'll see whether we're going to have a ceasefire or not, what's going to hold. Messy peace, which was a line a Goldman policy person had used, I think is actually a pretty good line of where we're headed. But there's kind of a handful of themes that I think are starting to emerge from this ongoing crisis, and we think it is going to be ongoing. The first is we've had this view of sort of power surge, a power super cycle. I think there's nothing about this crisis that seems to be getting in the way of that major theme, that there is a major power super cycle going on. And I think something as recently as the first quarter earnings with what you saw with hyperscaler revenues, CapEx, returns, margins, and so forth, I think is very reinforcing of that broader super cycle trend. I think one of the other big debates that keeps cropping up, and it started with Russia, Ukraine, it's continued to today, is are oil prices in a new super cycle? And we have kind of resisted or maybe rejected the super cycle framing. And you're seeing folks out there saying, hey, the real reason oil's not at 150 to 200 is the back end of the oil curve hasn't moved up. And that's what really needs to get going. Investors need to pile into the back end, and that's going to be the key to the new super cycle. And it's not obvious to us. We don't think the challenge today is finding molecules. I think the challenge is getting molecules to market. So areas like the downstream, areas like the midstream, we're talking about a broad spectrum of assets. That's what looks to be the challenge today. So we've stuck with this language, geopolitical supervol, be prepared for spikes, be prepared for pullbacks. We would remind everyone that if the Strait of Hormuz crisis does continue, forcing oil demand down from 105 to say 95 or 93, 105 minus 10 or 12 million barrels a day. That is a painful and ugly and recessionary type process. That does not speak to, oh, back end oil needs to rise. If you look back 20 years ago, back end oil had to rise because we didn't know where oil was going to come from. And we had to think, is it going to be deep water? Is it going to be Arctic? What are the things that are going to allow oil supply to rise? And what are the things that can be done to slow the growth rate of demand down? None of that describes the situation we're in today in terms of what would drive back end oil higher. So our viewpoint remains all the work is going to have to be done at the front end of the curve. That could mean further spikes, but can also mean pullbacks. It is about geopolitical supervol. I think the final thing we're going to talk about this coming weekend will be just what we're going to call the 4Ds of pragmatic energy policy. And I think people know we've believed in this hierarchy of energy needs where all anyone cares about at all time is energy available and reliable today? Ideally, it's affordable. And then geopolitical security is an overlay to ensure availability and affordability. And it's after those, in terms of preference, that some of the environmental considerations come in. And when you look at the 4Ds, do as much domestic production as possible, diversify your energy sources and technologies, do more from existing assets, and then the last one, embrace digital tech transformation and AI. And then we divide countries between those that are resource rich, have a lot of oil and gas, and those that are resource poor, and kind of rank them. And I will say amongst the countries that do not have a lot of oil and gas, they have some, but not a lot, is China. And I think when you look at their policy orientation, they rank very favorably on those 4Ds. Domestic, that's coal and solar and renewables. Diversified, clearly they're doing that, all of the above. Trying to do as much as they can from existing assets. Honestly, they deserve some credit for cranking out even more oil production from their limited base than we thought was possible. Maybe that's true for natural gas. And then clearly, there's probably no country that has embraced robotics, AI, automation, digital transformation, if you will, as is China. So I think, Maynard, really excited to speak with our guest today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
That's awesome. You know, and Arjun, as you were talking last week, because you were talking about, countries resource rich versus not resource rich countries. Interestingly enough, we also have that divide amongst states. And Alaska is a resource-rich state. That Secretary Burgum was talking about North Dakota as a resource-rich state. And those states tend to view things differently from non-resource-rich states. It's interesting we have the same divide going on in the country. Marshall, you can tell you got us all excited. We're all fired up this Tuesday. There's so many things we could ask you, from the China summit to China's view of Hormuz to the latest Chinese energy policies and sentiments. But maybe before we jump in on all that, would you mind telling our viewers a little bit about your program and what you've been doing, just so people level set and throw in some Tulane energy mojo, if you will, because we always love hearing about what's happening on campus in energy.
Sure. So I had a 20-year career as an energy equity analyst, and it was sort of my plan all along to go work in academia if I could get a gig that I wanted. And fortunately, there was an opening at Tulane about 5 years ago, right after we sold Heikkinen Energy Advisors, and I took that opportunity to join Tulane's business school as a finance professor. And originally, I was teaching basically half finance classes and half energy classes, but as some other professors have left, I've basically got a full energy course load. I teach 6 energy classes, 2 in the fall, 4 in the spring. I teach energy investment banking, energy financial modeling, which I think is my favorite class to teach, energy risk management, and an energy equity research class. I teach both undergraduates and graduate students, and Tulane has a Master's of Management in Energy program within the business school. And there's other schools that have Masters in Energy, but usually those are within the engineering schools or within the schools of science or something like that. But this is within the business school at Tulane. And Tulane's largest school is the business school. And I work with the Tulane Energy Institute, and we get about 30 or 40 Masters of Management in Energy students each year. It's a 1-year program. They learn energy accounting, energy policy, energy energy. Well, there's an energy fundamentals course that's early on, and they learn about energy trading and power pricing and energy financial modeling and energy risk management. And then there's a few electives as well that they take, but they sort of get a variety of energy classes to learn sort of many different aspects of energy, with the idea that they would go work either for a hedge fund or an investment bank, or work as a, within private equity, or go work within industry. And frankly, most of them go work within industry. And so I've been in that program for about 5 years, and we've had a partnership with the University of China Academy of Social Sciences, UCAS, in Beijing. They're a fairly well-known university within China, but they don't have a business school, so they partnered with Tulane to teach several business courses. And they actually have adopted China's interest in energy. They've adopted the Master of Management in Energy as well, and their students, which actually has more students in China than in the US for this Master of Management in Energy. And they teach they take 6 classes in China taught by Chinese professors, and then they take 6 classes taught by Tulane professors that come over and teach them specifically. They just took an energy fundamentals course and fundamentals in trading, and now I'm teaching energy financial modeling. It's an intensive course over 2 weekends, and this is the 5th time. Well, I've taught the course probably 12 times total, but this is the 5th time with China. The first 2 times were via Zoom back in 2021 and 2022, but this is my 3rd year in a row, 3rd summer coming to China to teach the course.
So Marshall, that's great background. Thank you for that. Maybe one place to start is just, I know it's kind of an unfair question because you'll have to generalize, but on the ground in Beijing with the students, in the news, connecting with others there, what would you say is the mood, the outlook, the perspective? Trump was just there a couple of weeks ago. Hormuz is happening. That must be coming up in your class. Just tell us about some of the attitudes that you are perceiving, on the ground in China.
I guess I'll approach it from a few different angles. One is that the Chinese government, is so, I guess before I jump into the students, maybe I'll just hit on one thing that I thought was interesting last week, and then I'll talk about my discussions with students. But I went to the National Museum, which is sort of the Smithsonian of China. It sits on Tiananmen Square, and it's a huge museum, sort of their main museum within the country. And you walk in, and the main exhibit, the temporary exhibit right now, is about their 14th 5-year plan. And that exhibit the 14th 5-year plan just concluded in 2025, and it was about ramping up Chinese manufacturing. And then the next 5-year plan is about continuing to ramp up Chinese manufacturing with a focus on AI and technology. And front and center, when you walk in the entrance, are an electric vehicle, a bunch of batteries, and solar modules. And the main thing that they wanted to highlight was their expertise in energy, in particular their expertise in renewable energy, and what they're doing on manufacturing there, and how the strides that they made over the last 5 years doing that. And their ramp up in solar module and battery manufacturing was just unprecedented. And I thought it was sort of amazing to think that our government tends to yank really hard in one direction and then yanks really hard in the other direction every 2 to 4 years. But this is a government that's got one party and that one party is very tied in with the economy, and they are pushing in one direction, and that's a major policy for the country is about growing their renewable energy capabilities, and that's part of the next 5 years too. My questions with students, the students that I teach really come from a wide variety of backgrounds. I did sort of a show of hands with the students and asked them what industries they were in, and there were 5 students or so that worked for oil and gas companies, a couple of them with CNOC. There were 4 or 5 students that worked for battery companies. There were, I think, 7 students that worked for electric vehicle companies. There were 5 that worked at utilities. So it was really a wide variety of, industries that were represented in the classroom. And there's an eagerness from the student perspective. I mean, they were really excited when we started going through how to model an E&P, like building a financial model on an E&P company, particularly the ones that were involved in oil and gas. Were just super excited to see how like a resource play model is built for a US company. They'd been hearing about shale growth for ages, but didn't know how to approach it. And they were super excited to see that. And, I think that why are the students in the class? They're in the class basically to promote their careers and within energy, which the government is very much promoting. And so that's why they're in the program. It's sort of for them to move up from entry-level-ish jobs to more mid-level jobs. In terms of Trump being here, I had several meals with students over the weekend, and they all sort of wanted to feel me out for, what I felt about Trump. And they were all they're excited to have Trump here. They were excited, like they were excited that he was here. And then the Russian president was here last week, so they were excited to have 2 presidents. And the city looks nicer than normal. They have lots of flowers out and things like that, which has generated some excitement, I think. There's been they're asking me questions about what's my take on oil price and what do I think about this Iranian war? And it's hard to have, like everybody else, but I don't necessarily feel like I have an edge on the war and how long it's going to take and that sort of thing. And that's the main driver of the oil market right now. And certainly if the war speeds up and wraps up, there's downside to oil price, but there's upside if it lasts longer. And I think everybody's sort of looking for who might have an edge, but nobody seems to have the edge. And there's certainly some stress around that. And the country, it seemed like, you would think that China as a huge importer would be really stressed right now, given oil prices and how much they have to import. They did build up inventories over the last several months before the war happened that sort of puts them in a better position than you might think they otherwise would be in. So, I don't think they thought the war was going to happen, but nobody did. But they were proactive about building inventories, which has given them some insulation and some protection right now to be able to weather this better than they otherwise would have.
All right, Marshall, I've got a totally unfair question for you, and I'll try to focus it on both sides of the equation.
Okay.
U.S. Academia in the U.S. has come under some criticism because it frequently doesn't have open, honest, both sides of the discussion. It can get a little polarized in America, and so we question sometimes our own intellectual honesty. That's this side of the world. I have no idea what it's like in China, but of course you do sense, or we all have a concern that you can't just speak your mind about anything and everything in China. What would you say about intellectual discourse, openness? What are you finding in your Tulane classrooms? Because I'm guessing when you started this 5 years ago, it was sort of a different energy world. It's much changed. Now you're in
right.
China in particular has changed over the last decade or so. So how are you finding openness, intellectual honesty, candid debate in both sides of the Pacific?
Well, I guess I'll give one story on sort of freedom of the press discussions. I mean, the Chinese government has a big say on messaging. I guess I'll put it that way. And like if you go to the airport on the way, I was reading Chinese newspapers over the last 3 years that were available in the airport, like in the the lounge before you leave, and it's like all good news in the newspapers. It's all good news all the time, and which is very different than you know U.S. newspapers and their approach. Um, you know, but it felt very filtered, and I did. You remember a few years ago there was like there was discussions around like this was like front page of the New York Times around labor practices in China and solar module manufacturing and I had a slide in one of my presentations about risk to you know risks within renewable energy, and it was like a headline risk concern for companies that might be involved in labor practices that would be questionable, to phrase it delicately. And that raised a big stink, and I had to take that slide down, and I had to apologize for having it in there in the first place. And I was like, wow, okay, I was just quoting something that was in the front page of the New York Times. So I didn't feel like I was stepping out on some crazy limb by mentioning that. But that was something that anyway, I had to do some backpedaling there. Um, in terms of, intellectual honesty, I think I mean, I guess, within the world of academia, there's lots of concerns about, using AI and cheating and what that looks like. Fortunately, within within the type of stuff that I'm teaching, I mean, students aren't writing papers for me. They are they're doing financial models that are very specific to certain industries and certain subsectors within those industries that I'm incorporating AI into the curriculum, and I guess I can go on that later. But it's they're not writing papers for me, so it's somewhat avoided um, for the stuff that I go through. But I will say that like the ability for and this isn't exactly what you asked, but the Chinese ability to like take apart and put together a spreadsheet is so much more advanced than Americans from what I've seen. And I had like an open book test this last weekend, and I guess it was an open book test, and like one student was able to finish it in like I was expecting him to take him like 45 or 50 minutes, and it took him like 8 minutes. And I was like, how in the world did he approach it that quickly? It made me a tad suspicious. But trying to keep things. I mean, AI is here, and AI is, I think a lot of students use it to take shortcuts on homework, and ultimately they're sort of like shortchanging themselves because if the homework's like used as a teaching tool, so then you do well on the test. But if you use AI to do your homework, how are you supposed to do well on the test and that sort of thing? And how are you supposed to do well in a job interview if you always use AI to answer things? So I try to set things up in my classes to like, you can use it for some things, but you can't use it for other things because I want you to be able to interview well, and I want you to be able to do well when you go get a job and you're expected to know certain things. I feel like the Chinese are taking a more aggressive approach to AI than America is, or is taken in the United States, and but they've always been a bit more computer savvy. Like anyway, and I could go into more details on that between like the differences between an American approach to a spreadsheet and the Chinese approach. But I think in China, they tend to just be more tech forward, and in the current world set up, that's favorable for them.
Marshall, I keep that's what I'm really struck by is in up until I feel like about 2016 or so, it was just typical for everybody in energy banking, energy research, energy conferences. You know, China was just, you went to China a lot. And then
Right.
that stopped. That stopped. And it really, of course, when COVID hit, that really stopped it. So I'm kind of intrigued by the attitudes you run into, you know, with a cab driver in the hotel, at the airport, just the man on the street impressions of being in China right now. And maybe I could ask you this one. A few weeks ago, we had a author on who had written about a book called Defending Taiwan. And it was all about, really, it was about US China competition and potential conflict.
Right.
Is it your impression that, you know, because I think in the US, increasingly, China's just the competitor, period. And sometimes it's kind of nefarious, is the interpretation. But is that the feeling in China, that the US is the competitor, that there is this unavoidable competition and conflict that the country is in with the US? Or how would you characterize that? I know that's a hard one, but it's certainly, that's increasingly the attitude in the US.
I mean, I haven't had students say like, you know, we think of the US as the enemy. You know, they haven't said that. Um, I've had a couple of students say that other people say the US is the enemy, but we really think Russia's the enemy. Um, and I thought that was sort of interesting. But certainly within the world of energy, which is where I've spent my whole career, you know, the US has been, it sort of feels like we were sort of lucky with the, I mean, yes, it's US policy, and yeah, we've got some great oil field, like the Permian Basin's an enormous oil field, and that's been driving the growth for the country over the last 20 years. But I feel like we lucked out with an abundance of natural gas and crude oil, and that's fueled all sorts of growth. And we've gone from importers to exporting, or at least neutral exporting on both commodities, and to become a top producer in the world on both those commodities. But at least for oil, that's going to slow way down within a few years. And the idea that the U.S. oil is going to plateau in 5-ish years. I mean, we were doing work at Icahn and Energy Advisors like in 2014, 2015 to try and predict when we thought the shale companies' growth would slow, and it all pointed to around 2030 or so. I mean, that was like 10 years ago, and at that point it was 16 years away, and now it's 4 or 5 years away. And I just don't think we have a great plan for what's gonna, where's our energy security going to come from after that? And China is really thinking about energy security, and no, they don't have a lot of oil and gas, but they can be a leader on renewable energy, and that's where they're going to put their resources. And you would think, other countries would start to be catching up, but it seems like China just keeps extending their lead. And it's like every time I do an update to presentations that I have, it's like, well, we're not catching up. China's just extending their lead. They're getting further and further ahead. And that's not just solar, it's batteries and it's electric vehicles. And, in Beijing, it's sort of disorienting. I mean, the cars, well, they don't have, the electric vehicles in the US have that when they're driving slowly, they sort of have that hum to them so you can hear them. They don't have that in China. So they're just completely silent. And so when I'm like walking around, and I love walking around, I probably walk like 6 or 7 miles a day around here. And there's just virtually no automobile noise and there's no noise from all the scooters that are everywhere because they're totally, they're all electric too. And so, and there's very little pollution. I mean, this is a city of like 23 million people. It takes 5 hours to drive across it if there's traffic. And it sits in a basin that you would think would have a lot of pollution, but it's like really clean. And like the air quality's high, and the the vehicles sold in China are like 50% electric vehicles. But if I had to guess as to what it is in Beijing, it's probably, 80% plus, because it seems like every vehicle is electric. So I guess that's my comment. That's my long-winded answer to your what's happening on the ground here.
Yeah, Marshall, good to see you after all these years.
Yes.
Looking
Yeah.
good, looking good, brother. Hey, you kind of hit a little bit on this, but AI is the issue of the day, right? Even, probably even of our lifetime. We saw the Pope literally over the weekend, come out and sort of talking about some concerns with AI. I really want to get a sense, you kind of hit this a little bit, but maybe the difference of where AI is with Chinese students and AI with your Tulane students. Is there a noticeable difference on how they're using those tools? And is there a sort of a different? It seems like the world is now stuck between, if we got to win the AI race. Whoever wins the AI race wins everything, right? Do you feel like that is the issue with U.S. students and Chinese students, or is it not an issue? Or we're just blowing this out of proportions?
So, when students I teach in a financial modeling class, and so people are doing financial projections, and I generally have the historicals in place, and we build out a template for how to forecast. We build like a model on a range of resources within the E&P front, and Tesla within the electric vehicle front, and Solar Edge, which is a solar component manufacturer. And on a lot of these companies, and I sort of talk about this with students, that like you can, if you take if you're trying to build a model on Tesla, and Tesla provides almost no guidance, so you've got a lot of leeway on how you're going to build the model. But once you got the historicals in, and if you read the last couple conference call transcripts and have some idea of what they're saying, if you want to build the model, you can build a sketch of an earnings projection and probably be within like 20% of consensus on EBITDA, and within 20% on revenue, within a matter of minutes, just by making best guesses on things like, okay, they're the number of vehicles, they're not going to have the robot out yet, and they're not going to have the full self-drive fully deployed yet. So for the next year, automobile sales would likely be down slightly, and the price per vehicle is going to be sort of flattish. And where gross margins been, and you can guess where expenses are, and you can do it within a matter of minutes if you're willing to just be aggressive and hop in a model and get after it. And I'll have students in the United States will stare at a spreadsheet like for 4 days at home and not enter, and be afraid to enter a cell because they don't want to enter the wrong cell, or they don't want to enter a bad input. And I'm like, well, no, just attack it and make a bunch of best guesses, and you'll be surprised at how close you are very quickly. If I do the same thing with Chinese students, they'll have a finished model like literally in minutes, and they're not afraid to attack it. They're just not afraid of computers and spreadsheets and anything to do with computers. It doesn't feel like they're just like, oh, I know how to do this. I'm just going to hop in and do it. And I feel like it's just a very different approach. And they're using AI as a tool to help with that, and they're really sharp at it. And it's a little difficult for me to tell when they're using AI and when they're not, because they're like, sometimes they'll use like translation tools to take the models which are in English, and they'll flip it to Chinese characters and then flip it back to English. So I can't tell whether the filter they're doing is an AI thing or whether it's a translation thing. But I know that they are like crazy fast at approaching projects. And some of the projects that I gave them that I was expecting to take them like 3 hours, they were knocking out in 45 minutes. And I think it's just a comfort with it. It's sort of like, well, anyway, there's just a comfort with it that allows them to be, you know, pretty dang good at it quickly.
Maybe just a follow up on that. That's really interesting to me. Um, do you think the reasons they're there at this point is just it's everything before they get to college and before they start taking courses, how they're taught in basically elementary school, high school, as opposed to how the U.S. students are taught? Is there do you find a noticeable difference there? Is that what we're saying? And if we think about that, do we need to think about how we educate our students?
Well, I think their choices like I mean, I think I don't know exactly how it works, but they're sort of like they take tests and that it sort of comes like it's like you're really good at math and science, you're going to be an engineer, and then they go to engineering school, and then they go to so you know they don't get the choice of, oh well, I really want to do this, so I'm going to be a lawyer instead. Like it's like no, you're good at math and science, you're going to be an engineer, so that's what you're doing. And then the college level stuff, it's sort of like they are they get tested, and that determines the track that they're in. And then the graduate school stuff is, it's my understanding that's all sort of elective. But I think the technology stuff, yeah, it starts early on with them, and they are there's an emphasis on technology and being good at it, and it starts early with them. That's the impression I get. I mean, I don't know. I haven't talked to them about how they're educated and like how fifth graders are educated right now. Um, but they're just very comfortable, like with an Excel model or like with programming, they're going to be able to do that, whereas they're going to be fluent at that. And in the US, there might not be, you know, I mean, certain they can get fluent in Excel, but you're not like average high school graduate isn't necessarily fluent in Excel in the United States, and it seems like at least the science track Chinese students very much are.
That's an incredible exchange, Marshall, with Mike there. And I want to build upon both that and something you said earlier about the nature of Chinese building out renewables and so forth. But I think on that last point, I'd love to see the comparison. It's not for you, it's probably for not us either, but sort of how Chinese students approach this stuff versus students in India versus students in America. I mean, that sort of is the future global competition. And I think certainly on the science and engineering, it's probably a cliche, but I think probably as Americans, we should have some concern about where Chinese and Indian students are. But I'm struck by a couple things, and I love the fact that your students uh, enjoyed hearing about shale modeling. I love the fact that you're sort of teaching a class that kind of gets into that teaches what it means to be an equity research analyst. I think that's absolutely fantastic. When I think about, um, if the United States had had a national champion oil company, we can call it Standard Oil if we want, we can call it some other name. My view is always that shale production would be zero in this country. That it is not the national champion that really gets out there and develops new technologies and aggressively grows and so forth. And people listening to this know the story of all the E&Ps that went after this. And now you've had bigger companies sort of in the later stages take on the full scale development. I think in China, the perception of Americans is that, and people know PetroChina and Sinopec, they're these national champions. It's a top down policy. We're going to have X amount of this and X amount of that. But my sense is that that does not explain the EV industry. It does not explain the battery industry. It does not explain any of these renewables industry where there actually is significant and intense competition. I'm curious if you can shed some light on how you would understand China's energy developments. As we all know, they are not rich in a lot of oil and a lot of natural gas. They have some. It's been these newer industries. How have they had, I'm going to call it shale-like success in EVs and batteries and storage? I know that may not be what you've studied and teach, but what's your observation on that from kind of studying energy and now being in China?
Well, it does feel like there's some similarities between the shale boom in the US and what's going on with like EVs in China. Um, you know, like back in the shale boom, call it 15 years ago. I mean, think how many like small and mid caps there were that were growing quickly, and there was a lot of excitement around that, and they were you had Carrizo growing at double digits, and small companies that didn't necessarily have the best acreage, but they were just getting after it. And there were lots of entrepreneurial shale companies making shale grow in the US. With electric vehicles in China, I mean, there's something like 40 or 50 manufacturers. Last night, one of my favorite and best students at Tulane that was an undergrad and then got a master's degree. He's actually from Beijing, and he took me around last night. He actually, believe it or not, lives in this neighborhood of all places in the world. And we went and looked at we went like electric vehicle shopping basically at the mall, because the electric vehicle companies, like, you don't go to a big huge car lot, and there's not like a car dealer in the United States where they're going to have 300 cars. You basically go to a mall, and you can go
The
and
Tesla model. I bought my Tesla at the Short Hills Mall, when I
Right,
first got
okay.
it. So yeah.
Yeah, so I went and we looked at like maybe 10 different electric vehicle companies, or the cars for electric vehicle companies, and I sat in, like, I don't know, 15 EVs, but a lot of them were small companies that I'd never heard of, and that aren't necessarily you know. And I was asking the student about the profitability, and says, oh well, they're not super profitable, and frankly, a couple of them went out of business last year. And I was like, well, what happens if you buy a car and they go out of business? How do you even get it serviced? And he's like, well, that's a great question, and it's a topic of great discussion around here. And but another similarity around the sort of shale boom is that if you this is a if you looked at like stock prices for oil and gas companies over the last 15 years, you would say that the shale boom likely didn't happen because the stocks performed terribly. And like, if you were just looking at stock price and stock price performance, you'd say there was no shale boom. The stocks have stunk. And I know, well, some of them are hitting all-time highs recently, but like, if you look from 2008 through 2023, the oil and gas sector was a huge laggard. Not because the shale boom didn't happen. It happened in a marvelous way. It grew so much faster than expected that the pricing and the profitability, we oversupplied the market. Everybody got lower, the margins were less than expected, and so stocks performed poorly over that 15-year period. And I think something similar has happened within renewable energy stocks, is that lots of aspects of the renewable energy or the energy transition are happening. Like, if you look at solar worldwide, I first started looking at solar as a sell-side analyst like in 2019, and the growth that we've seen globally has far exceeded what people thought it would be in 2019 in terms of like solar installations. The number of modules that are made each year has far exceeded that, but the price per module has been lower, and it's a very similar dynamic where it's like it's growing faster than expected, but the profitability is lower than expected. And I think there's definitely a big question in China about like, how is this going to be profitable? And and I haven't like necessarily dissected the financials of all these Chinese EV companies. I haven't even tried to do that, but I think there's some concerns about profitability and which ones are the companies that make it, and that sort of thing. And that's a concern for the investor, and it's a concern for the consumer, because you don't want to buy a car that is for a company that doesn't exist in a few years.
These are all such great points, Marshall. And I think there can be a perception out there that, we are, quote, capitalism, and our companies just compete on their own, and they are, quote, something other than that, where it's top down and they get subsidies and it's unfair and this and that. But like, there's a lot of similarities, and I'm not sure they don't have as intense a competition as we have. If some companies are, quote, supported by the government, I think I would be interested to know how that differs from the 0% interest rate policies we've had over the last decade. And there can be very different reasons for how these things evolve. But I think this pure good, evil, black, white view of markets and capitalism and China versus the US, I'm not sure there actually aren't more similarities, and where we see, quote, government support, it comes in different forms for these different systems. I'm not a deep student of this. I do think this is something worth exploring more, and really appreciate your thoughts on the matter. So thank you, Marshall.
Well, I guess on the subject of car shopping, one thing I was completely surprised by is the range on some of these electric vehicles. Like, I didn't believe it, and that I looked it up on the internet today. But some of the range on these hybrid electric vehicles is like north of 1,000 miles. I mean, it's like 1,600 plus kilometers, and apparently this was the Chinese road trip is like a new phenomenon here, where people want to get electric vehicles and hit the road, and they want to be able to drive like to Tibet, and not have to charge the vehicle.
You're going to get Maynard ideas for a future COB while you're talking, just to be clear. I'm trying to keep him safe and healthy. He's key to the success of Eridan, but I sense a major road trip coming up. So
anyway, I was like, a Chinese road trip, what? And but yeah, apparently like having a car with a really long range is like considered, that's something that they care about and talk about and want. And that didn't cross my mind. I thought that was like a U.S. phenomenon.
Oh, we don't even have gasoline cars that get 1,000 miles, do we? I mean,
no.
Like,
I've got like, if you've got a huge tank, I think about I haven't looked this up, but I think it's about like 500 miles is what like the best can get, but it's nowhere close to 1,000. And the car I looked at last night was like, it had a 900, and I was like, it's 900 miles and 1,500 kilometers. And I was like, is this the longest range vehicle there is? And they're like, no, they get longer than that. And another thing that I thought was just surprising is some of my students, and this just goes in the camp of things that I had to look up because I didn't believe them when they said it. They said that there's a solar conference in Shanghai next week that has 500,000 participants. And I was like, 500,000? Like, you got to be kidding me. And I looked it up, and then, yeah, there's a solar conference, a solar and power conference in Shanghai next week that has 500,000 participants. And I looked up to like compare that to what a big energy conference was in the US. And like CERA Week is something like 10,000 participants or something. I mean, this is like 50 times larger,
I mean, even ADIPEC, I think, is, what is it, 100,000 people now or something?
200.
How much money?
200.
200, yeah.
Yeah, I was just like 500,000 people. Like, how do you even? Anyway, that was surprising to me.
So, Marshall, question for you on this. This is fascinating. But you had said about 20 minutes ago in our discussion that the Chinese, I forget your quote, but it's basically like they're leading and the lead keeps growing.
Right.
And I had a mental note, circle back. What is he talking about? And then now you're talking about these 1,000-mile range EVs. Is that happening? Is that superior technology? Is that just more batteries? Like what type of technology breakthroughs? I think we've all seen a lot of the social media around all the cool things Chinese EVs can do. But what kind of technology breakthroughs do you perceive they're having in EVs or batteries or solar or any of it?
Well, on the 1,000-mile vehicle, that's actually a hybrid where it gets it has gasoline and the EV component. So it wasn't. There's a bit of a trick there.
Okay.
I don't think. I'm not sure if there's been any like enormous breakthroughs technologically. I think things are getting like incrementally better, like with the modules and the electric vehicles. It feels like it's getting. I think there's economies of scale, like with solar module manufacturing, and just a learning curve effect that like these big companies are benefiting from those two aspects, economies of scale and learning curve. But I don't think there's necessarily, no one's mentioned to me any enormous breakthrough of like, holy cow, we just unlocked this new thing that nobody else is doing yet. I think it's more just a manufacturing excellence kind of thing.
So I was thinking, when we talk about China, there's so many aspects to it, from critical minerals to all the things we've mentioned already. But one of the things that often comes up is population, and I think China has started to experience some of its first population declines, and we probably make too much of that, but it is a trend that people talk about. And the other one that seems related is robotics. And to some of the earlier comments, they do seem to be leading in automation at the same time that they're experiencing this population slowdown. Is there anything you could tell us there on the push for robotics, AI, automation, these dark factories that you occasionally see online, where 2 people and 1,000 robots are doing the work of 10,000 people? These types of things are fascinating. What would you tell us about that space?
I think, the subject of population has come up, and they are very much encouraging. Like for example, another thing besides EV stores in the mall, they had like a marriage license and a place, because they want people to get married and have kids. They are pushing that. And I guess from discussing this with students, so much of the value in China is real estate. There's not like, the US stock market is just like enormous compared to most other, like there's a lot of wealth in the US in the stock market, but in China, a lot of the wealth is real estate based, and there are mortgages associated with that. And since the peak pre-COVID, Beijing real estate prices are down. Like, one person quoted me 30%, another person quoted me 40%, which means the banks are under stress from having too much loan to value, with the values plummeted. And the banks are like, the financial system in China is really pushing for more population growth, in part to just boost real estate. That's like a major concern here. It's come up in like 3 different conversations. So that was a bit surprising in terms of like how the factories are operating with robotics. I haven't had many conversations on that front. I know that that's part of the aspect that's driving economies of scale and driving learning curve effect. It's like, Tesla's sort of a US leader in manufacturing, and I get the impression that there's a lot of Chinese companies that are doing something similar in terms of being able to put stuff together with a lot of robotics. But I haven't necessarily on that I haven't had conversations specifically on manufacturing with people. And the exhibit at the National Museum about manufacturing, well, frankly, it was in Chinese, and I had to, if I couldn't tell what was going on just by looking at it, I didn't know what the signs were saying because they were in Chinese, and I don't read Chinese.
You gotta get the meta glasses. I used them in Mexico, and it turns the Spanish into English. It's amazing, actually. So they're probably better versions in China, I guess. So.
Right. The first time I came here 2 years ago, I had a family trip scheduled. We were like whitewater rafting, and my phone got submerged, and it broke on the flight over. And so I showed up here with no phone. And so I couldn't like access my email. I couldn't access any money. I couldn't I couldn't call a cab. I had to like go onto my laptop. If I wanted to get somewhere, I had to like print out the directions or pull up the map of how to get there, draw a map on a piece of paper, and then walk there. And I couldn't communicate with anyone. And Google Translate's fantastic for like, talking into your phone and then it speaks out Chinese, or like looking at a sign and getting it to translate. That's fantastic, but I had none of that. It was a challenging 2 weeks, to say the least. And I all the food I got was like pantomimed, and I had lots of things that I wasn't expecting. I thought I was ordering one thing, and I ended up ordering something else. But I got through it.
I'd love to see you pantomiming to a Chinese, waitress or something like that. That'd be pretty fun to watch, Marshall.
Yeah, I thought I was trying to order a chicken dish once, and I got like cold clams and soy sauce, and I was like, should I even be eating this? But I had I ate I ate adventurously with no problems whatsoever. So anyway, I threw caution to the wind and I didn't get burned.
Well, you've teased us with some really good thinking here this morning and your evening, Marshall. Mike and Arjun, as we wrap up, any last thoughts on you guys' minds?
I did think people, in all seriousness, go over to China, and for a variety of reasons, different internet, maybe some other concerns, don't take their normal phones and laptops with them. They take maybe a second one that might not have a lot of apps and kind of American websites on it. So it doesn't, to me, I mean, I'm sorry that you lost your phone, and that's terrible, but I feel like
Right.
maybe what I hear from a lot of executives that go over there.
Yeah, I've been worried about using Wi-Fi. So I've just been like taking Wi-Fi off, and like my AT&T cell signal works great. And
That's
it's
great.
been pretty seamless. I don't like I'm not gonna like should it check my fidelity balance or something like that, you know what I mean? Or log into my bank account. I'm just scared to do that. But like all the other things, checking email and um, all the other things you do, I've been able to do that really seamlessly.
Well,
And
probably all governments everywhere are spying on us. We shouldn't accuse any singular government of only doing that. So, we can use our cell phones with caution in every country in the world, probably. So,
right, I did ask about. So there's a lot of cameras around China, and they do scan your biometrics on the way in. And I was talking with a student yesterday. I was like, "Is there any crime in Beijing? It feels pretty safe." And he was like, "No." He's like most thieves are caught within a couple of hours, if anything's stolen, because they're able to track where they go with all the cameras everywhere. I was just like, wow, okay, that's
we're
not
getting
the
close to that
experience.
pre-crime from that. Was it a Tom Cruise movie several years ago? We're getting pretty close to that, I think. So,
Wow.
Marshall, unfair question. We've had a number of nuggets in here that are really fascinating. But you've touched on, as we wrap up here, you've touched on some things that the Chinese are doing really well, that they're focused on, etc. You've touched on a couple of the problems. If you were thinking about China a decade out, all this push towards technology, the plans to have the appropriate power, energy, infrastructure for the government, but also some of the issues with could be population, could be real estate, etc. Where do you have China marked in a decade? Is it going to be kind of plus or minus the same type of geopolitical relevance that it has today? Or is the country just getting more and more powerful, and would you have them as, rising, so to speak, over the next decade? Like how do you think about it?
I think of them as like a super formidable competitor, and I just think that they're being really thoughtful. And if we're transitioning, away from, and I realize this is like a multi-decade transition away from oil and gas to other things, and it's more like the growth is coming from renewables, and oil and gas is likely here to stay for quite a long time. But when you sort of think about S curves, and like the US is like at the beginning part of an S curve, and it's going to take a while, and where it inflects is hard to predict, on EVs and batteries and solar. And I realize that there's other things besides, like there's wind, but I don't know where we're going to put all that wind in the US. And I just feel like China's just off to the races, and they're thinking in these 5-year plans, and it just feels like their manufacturing over the last decade has been tremendously successful, and their desire the next 5 years is to be an AI and technology leader, and it seems like they already are. I mean, they're in the U.S. and China are first in this race, and we're both sprinting. And but at least when it comes to energy, I feel like the U.S. is we're we had a great horse with the Permian Basin and the Bakken and the Eagle Ford and all that stuff, but like a couple of those horses are pretty tired, and China's got a fresh horse. Anyway, I just feel like they're going to continue to be a country to watch, and they're being aggressive, and it seems like they're being successful on that front, very much so, from what I can tell.
And just a dumb last question, Marshall, because I don't know how it works. If you just decided to grab one of those hybrids and drive around China 1,000 miles, is that something you as a foreign guy can do, or would you need special permissions?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. Yeah, I don't know. I've been mostly walking and taking the subway, and the cars are so, like, they dart around. So I don't know. I would be, even if I did have permission, I'd be afraid to do it, because I feel like it's sort of like do I want to drive in Manhattan? Could I? Yes. Do I want to? Would I choose to? No and no.
Okay.
Someone who drives through Manhattan, it's not that bad. So I'm going to say maybe the same thing applies in China.
Yeah, maybe so.
Well, this was a fun Tuesday after Memorial Day weekend. Check in on our friend Marshall and check in on China. Marshall, thanks a ton. Keep up the great work. Keep us posted. Yes, send us your best students, regardless of flavor. And anyway, we really appreciate it, my friend.
Sounds good. Great talking to y'all.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.